For 40 years, I saved lives in the ICU. Now, I'm fighting for my own. My stepdaughter and her husband have locked me in my own house, claiming I've lost my mind. Sterling's face was inches from mine, hissing that I was confused as he forced me away from the exit. He thinks a $5 million payday is worth a little elder abuse, but he hasn't realized that while he was busy looting my house, I was busy documenting his every move. He thinks I'm the target, but he's the one in my sights. Listen to the end to hear how I handled it, and subscribe to hear more of my journey. The key didn't fit. My thumb read the groove before my brain did. 40 years of muscle memory checking, double-checking, the instinct of a woman who has never once left a patient's chart unsigned or a door unlocked that should be locked. The Schlage cylinder was new. Screamingly, almost insultingly new. The brass glinted in the 10 o'clock Florida sun like a fresh wound against the weathered oak, and I stood on my own porch in my cycling jersey, salt damp from 5 miles of trying to out-pedal grief, and understood in the quiet, clinical way I understand most things that something had gone very wrong while I was gone. I hadn't even been away an hour. The jasmine along the front walk was still dewy. The neighbors' sprinklers were still running their Tuesday cycle. The world was utterly ordinary, and my home of 11 years had become a vault. Behind the frosted glass panel beside the door, a shadow moved. I watched it, the practiced stillness of someone who has spent decades reading vital signs, noting which way a patient's eyes track, which direction tells you whether they're fading or fighting. Not the gardener. Marcus moved with a loose, unhurried gait, and this silhouette was all sharp angles, squared shoulders, the particular stiffness of a person in an expensive suit who is performing confidence they don't entirely feel. The Florida humidity pressed against my back like a wet hand. My pulse, which I'd brought down to a disciplined 62 on the last half-mile, spiked into an ugly, jagged rhythm against my wrist. Not fear, exactly. More the specific physiological response I've always associated with the first 5 seconds of a code blue, the body doing its job while the mind races to catch up. I pressed the doorbell once. The door swung inward before my finger left the button. Sterling filled the frame. Navy blazer, single-breasted, bespoke. I could tell by the way the shoulders sat, too precise to be off the rack. Button tight despite the heat, which told me he'd wanted the armor. Beside him, half a step back, stood Ashley, clutching a manila envelope to her chest with both hands, the way a drowning person clutches a life preserver. She had her mother's cheekbones and nothing else of her mother in her. Neither of them said hello. Sterling extended a stack of legal documents toward me with the practiced smoothness of a man who has handed people their own devastation so many times it no longer requires ceremony. The papers were crisp. The ink looked fresh, the specific, slightly raised quality of documents printed that same morning. Emergency guardianship, Lillian. His voice was a carefully engineered baritone, calibrated for courtrooms and reluctant juries. The court agreed that after the stove incident and your wandering last night, you're a danger to yourself. I looked at the papers. The letterhead of the 11th Judicial Circuit Court. A judge's signature I didn't recognize. The date was this morning. My husband had been in the ground for 72 hours. I took one slow breath through my nose, a technique I'd taught myself in my first year in the ICU, when I learned that you cannot steady a patient's foreline with shaking hands. The jasmine smell from the walk mixed with the cold blast of the air conditioning pouring out around Sterling, and underneath it, something metallic and wrong. The stove incident they referenced did not happen. I have not left a burner on in my life. The wandering they cited was me, at 8 p.m., walking to the end of my own driveway to watch the sunset over the water, the way I have done every evening for 11 years. I had been home in bed by 9. I had also, with the habitual precision of a woman who knows that documentation is the difference between a patient who lives and one who doesn't, written both of those facts in my journal. Date, time, witness, Marcus, who had waved from the side yard. Data doesn't lie. I'll take those. He said it casually, the way you say pass the salt, and his hand moved toward my hip with a practiced smoothness that told me he'd planned the choreography. Before I'd fully parsed the motion, his fingers had closed around my smartphone, tucked into the side pocket of my cycling jersey, where I always kept it on rides, zipped in against a fall, and extracted it with a neat, unhurried pull. The snap of his fingers closing around it was very loud in the morning quiet. He dropped the phone into the breast pocket of his blazer without looking at it. Then his hand came out again, and he plucked the key ring from my other hand, the key that no longer worked anyway, but also the small brass fob with the button that opened the garden gate, and the tiny key to my bike lock, and the miniature skeleton key I kept on the ring from habit, though I could not have told you at that moment which lock it fit. "We're streamlining your environment, Lillian." He said it with the tone of a doctor delivering a compassionate diagnosis, and the performance was almost good enough. Too many gadgets cause confusion at this stage of cognitive decline. The keys went into his trouser pocket with a definitive metallic clink. I stood on my own porch in the sunshine and felt the specific, physical weight of what he'd just done. Not the loss of the devices themselves. I have never been sentimental about objects. What I felt was the architecture of isolation snapping into place around me like a cage being assembled in real time. My phone, gone. My keys, gone. My husband, 3 days in the ground. Sterling's carefully arranged facts, already filed with a court. I had practiced medicine for 40 years. I know what it looks like when someone has done their homework. I did not argue. Arguing is a waste of resources I couldn't afford, and besides, I have spent 40 years triaging, learning to read a situation for what it actually is, rather than what it presents as. You don't reason with a crashing patient and you don't reason with a sociopath who has already obtained a judge's signature. Both require different interventions entirely. I lowered my head, slightly, just enough to look like a woman gathering herself, and I stepped forward to shoulder past Sterling into my own foyer. I needed the landline in the kitchen. I needed my medical records, the ones I had kept, obsessively, for the past 3 years since my husband's diagnosis, precisely because I had always known this family and had always known what they were capable of. I needed, more than anything, the 30 seconds of privacy it would take to remember how to breathe. Sterling did not move. He stepped into my space instead, and his chest was a solid wall of navy wool and arrogance. I pivoted left and he mirrored me, unhurried, with the slight smile of a man on a squash court who has his opponent exactly where he wants her. I pivoted right. He was already there. Not touching me yet. Just present, absolute, a human redrawing of the borders of my world to the width of my own front porch. Behind him, I could see the foyer. I could see the pale rectangles on the walls already, the outlines left behind when pictures are removed, the ghost shapes of the 19th century landscapes I had chosen myself at auction in Charleston 15 years ago. My foyer. My walls. My ghosts. Move, Sterling. I kept my voice at the register I'd used for 40 years when a resident was doing something dangerous and I needed him to stop immediately but without panic. Level. Clinical. No question in it. He didn't move. His hand shot out instead, faster than I expected from a man his age, and clamped around my upper arm. Not a grip designed to guide. A grip designed to stop. His fingers found the thin muscle I'd maintained through thousands of miles on a bike, and they dug in, and the pain was sharp and specific and would bruise, which I catalogued in the part of my mind that was already compiling evidence. He leaned in close. I could smell the peppermint from whatever gum he'd been chewing, and underneath it something colder, metallic, an expensive cologne that smelled, to me, like the inside of a stainless steel drawer. Don't make this a scene, Lillian. His voice had dropped to something meant only for me. The concerned son-in-law register had slipped entirely and what was underneath it was something flat and cold and entirely honest. You're confused. If you struggle, the caregiver inside will be forced to use a sedative. A pause, perfectly timed. For your own safety, of course. His eyes held mine, and I looked back at him with the direct, unblinking steadiness I developed in the ICU watching patients decide whether to fight or let go. Stay in your lane. I filed that sentence away. The casual brutality of it, the boredom in it, the already won certainty of it. I filed the bruise on my arm and the smell of his cologne and the weight of his grip. I filed all of it with the same methodical precision I used to file medication errors, carefully, because you never know which document becomes the one that matters. Ashley had materialized from somewhere behind him while Sterling was speaking. She gestured down the hallway with her chin, her eyes moving past me and to the left, the way eyes move when they can't hold the thing they're supposed to be looking at. Out of the shadows at the end of the foyer, a woman emerged. Gray scrubs, but the wrong gray, not the soft, faded cotton of a hospital floor but the stiff, cheap polyester of a uniform purchased in a hurry, the kind security firms order in bulk. She was perhaps 40, thick through the shoulders, with the particular blankness of someone who has been told not to engage. "Help your mother to her new quarters, Brenda," Ashley said, her voice thin and rehearsed. Her mother. I have never been her mother. I married her father when she was 31 years old and had all the makings of the woman she's since become, and I held my tongue about it for 11 years because I loved my husband, and because I believed, foolishly, in retrospect, that family was a project you could work on. Brenda gripped my other arm. Not with Sterling's threatening strength, but with the bored efficiency of a woman moving furniture. And then they were steering me, one on each side, Sterling trailing behind, down the gallery toward the back of the house. I knew where we were going before we arrived. I have lived in this house for 11 years. I know the narrow hallway behind the kitchen that leads to what the original owners called the servants' quarters, a room designed for a different era's cruelties, small and windowless, with the particular stale smell of a space that hasn't been the main event in decades. The gallery walls told me everything I needed to know about the timeline. The pale rectangles. The bare hooks. Every painting I'd chosen and purchased and insured was gone, not sold, not moved, just gone, the kind of rapid clearing that happens when someone has been planning this for weeks and the funeral was merely the starting gun. Ashley moved along the sideboard as we passed, wrapping my grandmother's silver tea service, the set that had come to me from my mother, which I had cleaned myself every Thanksgiving, in grocery store bubble wrap with the frantic, clumsy movements of someone who has never wrapped anything valuable in her life. Sterling peeled off from our little procession to pause at the display case in the study. Through the glass door I watched his hand close around my late husband's Rolex collection, 7 pieces, each chosen by the man I'd loved, each representing a year, a trip, a milestone, and slide them into a black briefcase with the casual efficiency of someone packing for a business trip. This was not guardianship. This was not protection. This was a home invasion conducted with a judge's signature instead of a crowbar, and I was being walked to the pantry while they divided the contents of a life I had helped build, and sustain, and defend, and love for over a decade. I walked steadily. My chin was level. I gave them nothing. The door clicked shut and I was alone. The room was what I'd expected, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, the kind you find in summer camps and budget motels. A single dresser, veneer peeling at the corner. A dusty mirror mounted crookedly on the wall, reflecting a woman in cycling clothes standing very straight in inadequate light. The smell was dust and something faintly chemical, cleaning product used once and then forgotten. I sat down on the edge of the cot. My back remained military straight, a habit so old it no longer required effort. I closed my eyes and performed triage. Pulse, 88 and descending. Pupils, reactive to the light through the transom. Orientation, and this is the part they would not appreciate, the part that was, in its quiet way, my entire defense, orientation fully intact. Person, Lillian Miller, born June 3, 1951, Savannah, Georgia. Registered nurse, 40 years in the ICU at Coastal Regional and then at Memorial. Majority shareholder of an investment trust that has quietly compounded interest for 30 years while her name appeared on no document connected to a man named anything other than Miller. Place, 722 Harbor Lane, the servants' quarters, a room I have never intended to sleep in. Time, Tuesday, 10:14 in the morning, and the ink on that guardianship order was still warm. I catalogued the bruise on my arm, already purpling at the pressure points where Sterling's fingers had been. I catalogued the specific combination of behaviors they had demonstrated: isolation, physical intimidation, property seizure, fraudulent documentation. I had seen enough cruelty in my career, personal and professional, to recognize it when it was arranged this carefully. This was not improvised. This had been in preparation for weeks. I was not a victim. I was a clinician. And the patient in front of me was a situation, not a sentence. I stood and crossed to the small window. It was barred, a decorative ironwork that the original owners had installed for aesthetics but which served an entirely different function now, and it looked out onto the side of the garage, where the afternoon light came in at a low angle and illuminated the wall rack I had installed myself 7 years ago with a stud finder and a level and no help from anyone. The rack was empty. My breath caught. Just once, a single, involuntary hitch that I brought back under control before it could become anything more. My vintage Colnago. Carbon fiber frame, hand-built in Italy, 15 years old and maintained by me with the same methodical attention I had once given to medication schedules and post-operative wound care. I had replaced the cables myself last spring. I had adjusted the derailleur in February, lying on my back on the garage floor in my good jeans because I hadn't wanted to change. That bike had 43,000 miles on it, every single one of them mine. It was gone. They had removed it to reinforce the narrative, the confused elderly woman who shouldn't be trusted on a two-wheeled machine. A prop in their performance, a symbol of dangerous independence. They saw a senior's hobby, an old woman's vanity, something to be confiscated along with the car keys and the sharp knives. They didn't understand what the Colnago actually was. It wasn't exercise. It wasn't sport. 5 miles every morning meant 5 miles of sightlines, 5 miles of neighbors who recognized me, 5 miles of familiarity with every side street and service entrance and late-night bank drive-through within a 6-mile radius of this house. It was my reconnaissance route. It was the only vehicle I owned that started with my legs rather than a key or a pin. They had taken it. I made a note of where to look for it first. Through the thin plaster of the wall behind my head, I could hear Sterling on his phone. I did not move toward the wall or press my ear to it. I simply sat with the disciplined stillness of a woman who has spent decades learning to listen through curtains, through closed ICU doors, through the careful ambient noise of families who think the patient can't hear them. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my face neutral. I listened. His voice was sharp with the specific edge of desperation trying to perform control. He was talking to someone about a timeline. He mentioned the IRS twice. He mentioned a liquidation deadline with the emphasis of a man repeating a phrase someone else has applied to his life like a hot iron. And then the number. $5 million. I sat with it for a moment the way you sit with an unexpected diagnosis, not reacting immediately, not allowing the emotional impact to overturn the clinical processing that needs to happen first. 5 million. Robert's life insurance policy, which he had taken out 12 years ago at my quiet suggestion, naming me as sole beneficiary. I had known about it, filed the annual premium notices, watched it compound. I had not thought about it in the context of what Sterling might owe the federal government for the tech startup that had, I'd gathered from overheard conversations over the last 2 years, collapsed spectacularly into what sounded like fraudulent accounting. I was not Robert's widow to Sterling and Ashley. I was not a woman. I was not a life. I was a $5 million obstacle standing between two desperate people and their federal indictment. They needed me incompetent, compliant, and either medicated into silence or waiting in a memory care facility 4 hours away while they dismantled everything and called it estate management. They wanted me to fade. I sat in the servants' quarters of my own home and I almost smiled. I surveyed the room with the systematic eye of someone doing an inventory. They thought they had stripped me. They had taken the obvious things, the phone, the keys, the jewelry I'd been wearing, the bike. They had no imagination for what they'd left. They had filed their guardianship against Lillian, the surname of a woman who had taken her husband's name on a marriage certificate 11 years ago and used it in every social, domestic, and neighborly context since. The Lillian who had cooked in this kitchen and attended the HOA meetings and signed the holiday cards. They did not know about the other Lillian. The safety deposit box at the downtown branch of Second National was rented to Lillian Miller. My nursing license, which I had maintained in active status out of habit and the particular vanity of a woman who earned it, was under Miller. Every professional credential, every investment account, every document connected to 30 years of quiet, methodical asset management, Miller. My maiden name was not sentiment. It was architecture. The guardianship they had filed this morning was a wall built in the wrong place, and I was already standing on the other side of it. I heard the heavy tread of Brenda's sneakers coming back down the hallway, a specific, flat-footed shuffle I had already memorized. I had perhaps 10 seconds. I let my shoulders drop. I let the military posture soften and curve. I let my jaw go slightly slack and allowed my eyes to lose focus, to go watery and unfixed, the expression I had seen 1,000 times in patients whose light was genuinely dimming. I was back on the cot, shoulders rounded, hands loose in my lap, by the time the latch turned. Brenda opened the door and brought a tray. Lukewarm soup, crackers, a cup of juice. She set it on the dresser with the efficiency of someone delivering room service to a guest she's already forgotten. I reached for the spoon with a trembling hand. The tremor was controlled, specific, too much in the wrist, a slight overshoot, the kind of movement that reads as neurological rather than emotional. 40 years of watching hands. I know exactly how they fail. Where is my husband? I whispered. I let my voice crack on the last word, just the right amount. Brenda sighed. The particular exhalation of a woman who finds her job boring and her charge pitiable. She patted my hand once, the way you pat a dog you don't own. He's gone, honey. Just eat your soup. I nodded. I let my eyes drop to the bowl. I heard her turn and leave, and I listened to her footsteps recede down the hallway, and when they were far enough away I raised my eyes to the crooked mirror on the wall and looked at myself for a long moment. 73 years old. Silver white hair damp from the ride. Steel gray eyes that had not, in 40 years, found anything worth flinching from. I picked up the soup spoon and ate the soup. Cold as it was. Because I would need my energy, and because there is no tactical advantage in refusing nutrition, and because the long game requires patience above all things. They thought the light was out. That was fine. It is considerably easier to work in the dark. I was at the window when they walked Javier out. The glass in the servants' quarters had a film of salt on it. We were close enough to the water that everything accumulated a fine, crystalline haze if you didn't clean it every week, and no one had cleaned this window in months. Through that blurred pane I watched Sterling stand in the driveway with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and I watched Javier, 12 years of Tuesday mornings, 12 years of him arriving at 6:30 with his truck and his thermos, knowing before I did when the bougainvillea needed cutting back. I watched Javier gesture toward the hibiscus hedge with his hands open, the universal language of I was in the middle of something, his face doing the particular work of a man who cannot understand what he's done wrong because he hasn't done anything wrong. The security guard walked him to the gate anyway. I pressed my fingertips against the salt-streaked glass. Not hard. Just the light, specific pressure of a woman taking a pulse. Javier was the last person on this property who saw me every morning as myself. Not as the patient or Mrs. husband's name, or the widow, or the obstacle standing between Sterling and a cleared IRS debt. He saw me come back from my rides, flushed and alive, sometimes stopping to deadhead the roses with my cycling gloves still on. He knew I maintained my own bike. He knew I could name every plant in the front garden and diagnose a nitrogen deficiency from 30 feet. He saw me as an athlete rather than a patient, and that specific species of being seen was now marching out the gate with his thermos and his confusion and his 12 years of quiet, uncomplicated loyalty. Sterling watched him go without moving. Then he turned back toward the house, and even through the salt-smeared glass I could see the small, satisfied adjustment of his shoulders, the body language of a man who has just completed a task on a checklist. The perimeter was sealed. Every set of eyes left on this property was his. I took my fingers off the glass and turned away. Medication time, Lillian. Brenda announced it the way people announce things they find tedious, loudly, without inflection, aimed at a general area of the room rather than at a person. She thumped the plastic cup onto the nightstand with a sound like a gavel. I was sitting on the edge of the cot in the same position I'd been in all morning, shoulders appropriately rounded, gaze soft and middle distance, the portrait of a woman whose thoughts were occurring somewhere else. 2 pills in the bottom of the cup. One small and white. I recognized the coating, the size, the particular chalky sheen. A basic anxiolytic, the kind they hand out in understaffed facilities the way you'd hand out breath mints. Minimally concerning. The second pill was the problem. Dull yellow. Slightly elongated. The specific chalky texture of a compound I had administered, held, counted, and documented several hundred times over a 40-year career in the ICU. An antipsychotic. A potent one. The kind prescribed for genuine psychiatric emergencies in patients with documented histories, and also, and this is the part that activated every clinical instinct I possess, the kind that gets used in understaffed memory care units to make difficult residents manageable. The medical literature calls it chemical sedation. The families who discover it later call it other things. Within 48 hours, regular doses would produce lethargy, slurred speech, genuine, measurable cognitive fog, word-finding difficulties, slowed processing. All of it documentable. All of it, if you didn't know what you were looking at, consistent with the exact neurological picture they'd already invented for me on a judge's signed order. They weren't treating a condition. They were manufacturing one, because they needed their paperwork to match reality before anyone with actual medical credentials looked closely at their incompetent ward. "Thank you, Brenda," I said, my voice appropriately thin. I needed to be perfect. I took the cup in both hands with a visible tremor, wrist-based, slightly overcorrecting, the motor pattern of a person whose fine motor loop has developed a small but persistent lag. I had watched that tremor for 40 years in patients whose neurological decline was genuine. I knew exactly what it looked like from the outside. The cup came to my lips. I took a sip of water first, that part was real, because I needed my mouth adequately wet for what came next. Then the pills. And in the half-second between the pills touching my tongue and my throat beginning its convincing swallow, I moved them. Cheek and palm. A technique I'd first seen in my second year in the ICU, executed by a patient named Gerald who had decided, with full cognitive clarity and no small amount of ingenuity, that the medications he was being given were making him feel worse. The pills slide sideways off the center of the tongue, tucked into the rear pocket of the gum line, held against the back molars by the natural tension of the cheek. The swallow is real, water and saliva going down. The throat moves correctly. The sound is correct. I swallowed. I lowered the cup. I allowed 2 seconds of nothing, and then I turned toward Brenda and opened my mouth slightly, letting her see an empty tongue and an empty throat. Her head had tilted while I was drinking. That was the tell, a slight suspicion, probably not conscious, probably trained into her by working with people who were actually attempting this. I held the display for 3 seconds. She looked. Then she made a small sound that wasn't quite satisfaction and left, and I listened to the bolt slide home on the other side of the door. I held the position for 30 more seconds. Then I spit the bitter, partially dissolving mass into the tissue I had folded under my palm since before she entered the room. The loose floorboard under the cot was a discovery from my second night in this room, a small warp in the old pine planking, left over from this room's previous life as storage, when things were stacked on it and the humidity had worked at the wood for decades. It lifted with light pressure in the right spot. I'd found it by sitting on the floor and pressing my palms along the boards in the dark, the way you find a stud in a wall by tapping, listening for the change in resonance. I lifted the board just enough and dropped the tissue in. It joined the previous 2 dozes in the dark beneath the cot. My small, quiet graveyard of their chemical weapons. 3 doses they believed were dissolving through my bloodstream, 3 doses that were instead dissolving into damp pine and darkness. I replaced the board, eased myself back onto the cot, and arranged my face into its appropriate configuration. Data doesn't lie. And the data said I had, so far, maintained every one of my advantages. The dresser drawers opened with a bang about an hour later. Ashley moved through the room the way she moved through most things, at speed, without looking at what she was actually doing, sustained by an agitation that had always struck me as the specific product of a person who wants things and has never learned to be uncertain about whether she deserves them. She pulled my folded cotton underclothes from the second drawer and dropped them on the floor without ceremony, her hands already moving to the next drawer. "Where are the offshore folders, Lillian?" Her voice was half an octave higher than usual, the polished sterling usually imposed on their household stripped away by whatever internal pressure had been building since last night's timeline conversation. "Dad said you kept a separate ledger for the Savannah properties." She was looking for the Lillian Miller paper trail. The shadow economy I had managed with disciplined patience for 30 years while my husband was the face in the photographs at charity galas and civic dinners. She had some idea it existed, probably from something Robert had said, some half-reference, some breadcrumb dropped without understanding what it pointed to. She was looking for a filing cabinet. She had not yet understood that what she was actually looking for was not a file. It was an identity. She didn't look at me once while she searched. I was furniture. I was a safe she was trying to crack by touch. The room felt very small with both of us in it and her energy filling it like heat. "Savannah?" I let my voice go soft and slightly upward at the end, the way voices wander when the mind that generates them has lost its anchor. I turned my gaze to the upper right corner of the room, the specific eye movement associated with memory retrieval, but softened, slowed, made to look like the unfocused drift of someone who has arrived at the wrong memory. I dragged one finger along the hem of the bedsheet. "The peaches were late that year," I said. "Did you bring the peaches, Ashley?" The silence lasted 2 full seconds. I watched, in my peripheral vision, the muscles of her jaw tighten. The particular jaw tightening of a person who is disgusted rather than concerned, which told me everything I needed to know about what this visit had been and was not. She slammed the drawer. The sound was sharp enough that I allowed myself a small flinch, genuine, because the sound was genuinely startling and it costs me nothing to let her see that. "God," she said, her voice dropping to something she didn't intend me to hear clearly. "You're useless." The door opened and closed and I was alone again with my clothes on the floor and the particular cold weight of what this performance cost me. It is a bitter thing to have spent 40 years building a professional identity on the precision of your mind, on the diagnostic speed, the pharmacological knowledge, the ability to read a vital sign and know what it means before the monitor catches up, and to save your life by systematically performing the absence of all of it. Every trembling hand, every wandering sentence, every vacant gaze was a small controlled demolition of the self I had made. But as long as they thought I was hollow, they wouldn't look for the thing still running inside. Sterling came after dinner, and he brought a notary. The notary was a man named Henderson, according to the brief introduction Sterling provided, and Henderson wore a cheap suit with the resigned quality of someone who has learned not to ask about the circumstances of the documents he's asked to witness. He carried a briefcase. He sat in the room's single chair and opened it. Sterling spread the document across the small desk with the efficiency of someone who has done this before, the quick, practiced flattening of paper, the alignment of signature lines. Durable power of attorney. I read the relevant sections in the 12 seconds I was permitted to observe it before Sterling's hand moved to the signature line and his other hand extended the pen toward me. Gold. Weighted. The kind of pen that says authority and legitimacy, and this is a normal thing that is happening. This just helps us pay the bills, Lillian. His voice had recovered its courtroom register, the studied, patient baritone of a man explaining something complicated to someone he's decided can't be expected to understand it. It gives me the authority to move the trust assets so we can keep you in this beautiful home. He was not asking. He was directing a performance in which I was the only cast member who hadn't received the full script, and he expected my participation through the same mechanism he'd been using since Tuesday morning, the accumulated weight of isolation and helplessness and the reasonable fear of what happened to people who refused. I looked at Henderson. Henderson looked at his briefcase. I looked at the pen. I pushed it back towards Sterling across the desk. I don't know this man, I said, pointing at Henderson with one careful, deliberate finger. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. I counted them by my pulse. Then Sterling's face did something I had been waiting for since Tuesday morning. The controlled, professional surface cracked from the inside out, and the color that replaced it was the specific red-purple of someone whose blood pressure has just made a significant decision. The concerned son-in-law didn't slip away gradually. It left all at once, like a power outage. Sign the damn paper, Lillian. He leaned over the desk and the room got smaller around him. I have IRS agents breathing down my neck because of that startup. $5 million is sitting in that policy and I am not going to jail because you want to play confused 1 minute and stubborn the next. His shadow fell across the document, across my hands, across the narrow width of the cot behind me. Henderson was examining something very interesting on the floor near his left shoe. I looked at Sterling's face and I let him see nothing in mine. In the ICU, you learn that the moment a patient or a family member begins to shout is the moment you have, paradoxically, the most information and the most control. Shouting is a confession. It tells you exactly what they're afraid of, exactly what they need, and exactly how far they have already departed from the rational management of a situation. Sterling was telling me, in plain language, that the IRS had a deadline, that the $5 million was the only solution he had, and that he was prepared to do what desperate people do. I already knew all of this. But it was useful to hear him say it out loud, in front of a notary. Henderson packed his briefcase and left first. Sterling snatched the papers back from the desk with a motion that was trying to be decisive and landed as desperate instead. He stood in the doorway, filling it, the way he filled my front door Tuesday morning, and this time there was no practiced baritone. This was the voice of a man who has run the calculations and arrived somewhere frightening. Fine, he said. If you're too incompetent to sign, then you're too incompetent for home care. A pause, to let it land. The transport is being scheduled. There's a facility in the Glades. Locked units. High-dose therapy. Another pause. No visitors. The door slammed. The sound hit the thin walls of the room and bounced, and then the silence after it was absolute. The central air hummed. Somewhere in the main house, something was being moved, the low scraping of furniture against hardwood. I sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the crookedly mounted mirror across from me. He had just given me a deadline, 36 hours, perhaps less, before I became Lillian the patient in a locked unit 4 hours from anything that had my name on it. Before the daily medication, genuinely administered, genuinely absorbed, began its work on the neural pathways he needed erased. Before I was, in any practical legal or medical sense, the person he had already described on his court documents. The code blue of my life. And I was the only responder. The sun went down over the gulf while I stood at the barred window. The security came around the far corner of the fence at 7:43, 2 men I hadn't seen before, thick-necked and unhurried, and between them a German shepherd on a short lead, the leash held taut and low, the dog's attention moving with the specific, constant scan of a working animal. They walked the perimeter in a pattern I began immediately to memorize. The dog's handler checked the side gate. His partner watched the water. They weren't watching for someone trying to get in. They were watching the house. Sterling had turned my estate into something that required a name I was careful not to say, even in my own mind, because that kind of thinking is a luxury you can't afford in triage. What I said instead was, "This is the presenting situation." The dogs were physiological deterrents, calculated, smart, the specific choice of a man with a legal background who knows that the threshold for proving elder abuse is different from the threshold for proving unlawful restraint, and that a 73-year-old woman and a trained shepherd have a predictable relationship. He was right about the shepherd. He was wrong about the woman. The adrenaline came in then, clean and cold, the specific surge I have always associated with the first 30 seconds of a resuscitation, the moment the body commits to the work. In the ICU we called that feeling task focus. It crowds out everything that isn't useful and leaves only what the situation requires. I began to plan. At 9 p.m. I tried the door handle. The deadbolt's click was heavy and external, a through mortise lock with a separate cylinder on the outside, requiring a key I did not have. Not a privacy lock. A security lock. A jail lock, installed on the servants' quarters door at some point in the last 2 days by someone who had thought ahead. I stood in the dark. They had taken the lamp's functional bulb and left a non-functional decorative one, and I had not been provided a replacement, and listened to the sounds of the house settling into its nighttime patterns. The air conditioning cycling. A television in the main wing, volume low. The distant, periodic sound of the security route outside. They were confident. And confidence, in my experience, is the most reliable precursor to a critical error. It narrows the field of imagination. It stops you from asking what if. It produces patterns, and patterns produce predictability, and predictability is what I had been doing all my working life. They had accounted for my age. My grief. My isolation. My missing phone and keys and transportation. They had not accounted for the fact that I had not yet completed my shift. I counted through the night using my pulse as the metronome. 63 beats per minute, steady. Every 20 minutes, 1,260 beats, the security route brought the handler and the dog past the garage. I tracked the timing against the sounds, the scrape of the paved path, the jingle of the shepherd's lead, the man's footsteps, which were louder going away than coming toward, which told me his heel strike was heavier than his toe strike, which told me about the wear pattern of his boots, which told me his route was consistent and habitual. Between the moment the guard turned the kitchen corner and the moment he reached the pool deck, 90 seconds. I timed it against my pulse 4 times in sequence to confirm. 90 seconds of unmonitored space adjacent to the side garage door. I knew that door. I had used it for 11 years, propping it open in the mornings when I brought my bike through to the garden path. The latch was old and slightly warped. It required lifting the handle as you pushed, an idiosyncrasy the house had developed 6 years ago that I had never gotten around to having repaired. 90 seconds. A warped door latch. A memorized floor plan. In the ICU, 90 seconds is not nothing. 90 seconds is the time between irreversible and recoverable, if you use them correctly. I lay on the cot in the dark and mapped the terrain behind my eyes, every route in the garden path, every shadow cast by the exterior lights, every distance between the servants' quarters window and the garage door and the street. I mapped it the way I had once mapped every line on every monitor in a 12-bed unit, until the geometry of it was as automatic as breathing. The fresh air walk was 15 minutes, supervised, in the small garden adjacent to the kitchen patio. Brenda walked behind me with her phone in her hand, thumb moving in the specific pattern of someone scrolling while performing a task she finds insufficiently stimulating. The garden needed attention. Javier had been maintaining it on a schedule I had approved, and without him, 2 days had been enough for the humidity and the growth rate of coastal Florida to begin reasserting themselves. The bougainvillea was already reaching toward the path. That was how I saw it. Half buried in the mulch at the base of the hibiscus hedge where Javier had been working when they walked him out, a small, flathead screwdriver, the short-handled kind that fits in a work belt and falls out when you're gestured away from your task before you've had time to collect your tools. 4 inches of metal, the blade end catching just enough of the morning light through the overcast that I was looking in exactly the right direction to see it. I calculated the distance, the angle, Brenda's current position relative to the patio door glass she was beginning to examine with the attention of a woman using it as a mirror. I stumbled. The fall was controlled from inside, a forward shift of weight onto the right foot, a deliberate ankle roll that wouldn't produce actual injury, a descent that slowed just enough on the left hand to prevent impact. I went down on my right knee with a sound of genuine effort and I palmed the screwdriver in the motion of a person catching themselves, the metal cold and specific in my grip. "Oh, my knees," I said, my voice going thin and aggrieved. Brenda looked up from the glass. She looked at me on the ground. She did not move toward me. She sighed, the sigh of a woman who has decided that helping me up is not in her job description, and looked back at the patio door. I got myself up slowly, with appropriate effort, and I tucked the screwdriver into the waistband of my compression leggings as I rose, the small flathead resting cold against the skin above my hip bone. I brushed the mulch from my knee. I took a slow, arthritic step toward the patio. Behind the waistband of my leggings, beneath the silk tunic that fell to mid-thigh, the screwdriver waited. 4 inches of steel that Sterling and his security team and his borrowed German Shepherd had not thought to account for. My first piece of equipment. Now I just needed the night. I had been leaning against the tool shed for 40 seconds, long enough for Brenda to file it as resting rather than observing, which are two entirely different things that look almost identical from the outside. My breathing was controlled, slightly audible, the sound of a woman whose knees have been objecting to the morning walk. The garden was humid and overcast, the particular flat light of a Florida morning that can't decide whether to rain. The bougainvillea along the shed wall needed cutting back by at least 8 inches, which Javier would have seen to on Friday. Javier wasn't here. The bougainvillea was. And behind the stack of terracotta pots stacked against the shed's east wall, the overflow pots, the ones we used for seasonal replanting, a glint of plastic in a Ziploc bag. He had left it in the dead drop. For 3 years, the dead drop had been our system for the small logistics of household management, extra keys when I'd forgotten mine, bags of the specific mulch I preferred that he'd found at a different supplier, a spare padlock combination when I'd changed the gate code and needed to get it to him on a Sunday. A terracotta pot, a Ziploc bag, wordless communication between two people who had been doing the same job at the same address long enough to develop their own shorthand. He had been marched out of this property 2 days ago with his thermos and his confusion, and before he went, or perhaps after, in the dark, quietly, through the fence gap near the hibiscus that I knew existed and Sterling security apparently did not, he had left me a lifeline. My heart did something slow and heavy in my chest. Not sentiment. More the specific physiological response to a variable you'd written off reappearing in the data. I did not look at it. I did not reach for it. I shifted my weight against the shed wall and breathed audibly and watched Brenda in my peripheral vision until her hand went up to swat a mosquito off her left forearm, a motion that turns the body a precise 12 degrees and occupies the eyes for between 1 and 2 seconds. One fluid, practiced motion. The Ziploc went into the pocket of my tunic. The motion had the shape of a woman pressing her hand to her hip for balance. I pushed off the shed wall and began the slow walk back to the patio. The plastic bag felt like a live wire against my hip. I made myself walk at the pace of a woman whose knees were bothering her, which they were not. I made myself look at the garden path, which meant I was not looking at Brenda, which meant she had no expression to read on my face. By the time the servants' quarters door closed behind me I had already planned the next 4 steps, but I performed the waiting anyway, sat on the edge of the cot, hands in my lap, the vacant and slightly fatigued expression of a woman who has had a walk and is now resting, until I heard the heavy click of the deadbolt engaging. Then I let myself breathe. The medical library they'd left on the shelf was a small mercy born of their carelessness, remnants of the books I'd kept in my study, the useful ones, the reference volumes I'd accumulated over 40 years of practice and had never found a reason to discard. They'd shoved the stack onto the shelf without looking at the titles, which is the kind of mistake made by people who don't read and therefore don't understand that books are not decorative objects. Tabor's Cyclopedic Medical Dictionary, 22nd edition. 3 inches thick, 4 pounds, the spine worn at the bottom where I'd rested it against desk edges for 2 decades. I had used this book to look up drug interactions at midnight, to settle arguments with residents, to teach nursing students the difference between a sign and a symptom. It had been, for most of my career, one of my primary tools. It was about to serve a different function. I sat cross-legged on the floor with the book in my lap, the screwdriver in my right hand, and I worked carefully and methodically, pressing the blade flat along the interior gutter of the pages, cutting in small increments, removing sections with the same precise, unhurried attention I'd once given to removing sutures. The paper came away in neat rectangles. I cleared a cavity in the middle third of the volume, 4 inches wide, 6 inches tall, deep enough. The burner phone, cheap prepaid, the kind you bought at any drugstore and paid for in cash, slid into the paper nest and disappeared. I replaced the book on the shelf, spine out, in the same position. I sat back on the cot. I had a phone. I had a screwdriver. I had documents and cash against my skin in a waterproof pouch I'd assembled from a freezer bag in the waterproof liner of my cycling fanny pack, which had been in the servants' quarters from before the coup because I'd left it here to charge and they hadn't thought to search it. I was no longer just a prisoner. I was a resistance cell of one, operating in an 8x12 room behind a deadbolt door, and the next move was already clear. I waited for 2 in the morning. This was not arbitrary. In the ICU, 2 a.m. is the particular hour when the human body and the humans monitoring it are both at their lowest ebb, the circadian valley, the point at which alertness, reaction time, and the capacity for careful observation all reach their nadir. Night shift nurses know this. Night shift security guards know it whether they know it or not. The ones with military or law enforcement backgrounds have been trained to push through it. The ones on private residential security detail have not. The house had been quiet since 11. Through the wall, I'd heard the television in the main wing go off at 11:40. At 12:30, the security rotation had slowed, their 90-second gap stretching to nearly 2 minutes on the last 2 passes I'd clocked. At 1:15, the dog had audibly settled somewhere outside, the low, comfortable sound of a working animal taking advantage of a quiet hour. At 2 a.m., I took Tabor's off the shelf, extracted the burner phone, powered it on under the blanket to contain the screen glow, and dialed the number I had maintained in active memory for 16 years because Sarah Chen was one of the people you simply kept memorized. The ringing was very loud in the small room. I held the phone against my ear with both hands and waited, counting rings. Lillian? Her voice came on the 3rd ring, thick with sleep and already sharpening. Sarah had spent 20 years on the night shift. She could go from unconscious to clinical in approximately 4 seconds, which was one of the reasons she was one of the best charged nurses I had ever worked with. Sarah, listen. I kept my voice at the register you use when you need to be heard through a closed door without being heard through a second closed door, barely above a whisper, very precise. I'm being held. 722 Harbor Lane. Guardianship fraud, asset seizure. I need a welfare check at dawn. Don't call the house number. Send a cruiser and a ride. Come to the gate. A beat. I heard her sitting up. Are you? It's real. I've been here 4 days. I'm not impaired. I'm being drugged and I've been palming the medication. The clinical framing was deliberate, it was the language that would land fastest, the handoff report format we'd used for 2 decades. Patient status, current situation, required action. I need eyes on this property at dawn before they can move me. Another beat, shorter. Understood. The sleep was entirely gone from her voice now. We're coming for you, Lil. I powered the phone off and returned it to the paper cavity in Tabor's and replaced the book on the shelf and lay down on the cot in the dark. For the first time in 4 days, the ice that had been sitting below my sternum since Tuesday morning shifted. Not gone. But the specific cold of complete isolation had changed temperature. Someone outside these walls knew. Someone was moving. I did not let myself call it hope. Hope is a metabolically expensive state and I couldn't afford the physiological cost. I called it a variable. A confirmed variable. That was enough. I did not sleep. I spent the remaining hours in preparation, which was better use of the time in any case. The 3 layers of high-performance cycling gear went on under the silk housecoat, wicking fabric, tight-knit, designed for long endurance in variable weather. I had packed it at the back of the small dresser 2 days ago, disguised under the folded house dresses, and they had not thought to search what remained of my clothes after Ashley's frantic drawer rummaging. The fabric compressed to almost nothing under the housecoat. From the outside, I looked like a woman in her nightclothes. The waterproof pouch went against my skin, secured by the compression waistband of the innermost layer. Inside it, my maiden name birth certificate, a copy I'd kept for precisely this category of contingency, the small brass key to the second National Safety Deposit Box, and $1,400 in hundreds, folded twice. The cash was from a habit I'd maintained since my nursing school years, the practical wisdom of a woman who'd grown up understanding that institutions close and systems fail and sometimes the most sovereign thing you can carry is a number you can hand to a person directly. I checked the screwdriver's edge in the thin light from the window. The flathead was still true. I turned it in my hands once, the weight of it familiar now, and tucked it into the pocket of the housecoat where I could access it in one motion. The ICU adrenaline settled over me like a change in barometric pressure, the code blue calm, the specific mental state I had spent a career cultivating and which had never, in 40 years, failed to arrive when I needed it. Not the adrenaline of panic. The adrenaline of a system that knows what it's doing and is doing it. My vision was sharp. My hands were steady. My heart rate was 61. I was a 73-year-old woman in a locked room preparing a tactical extraction. I had done harder things with less preparation and worse equipment. The blue and red light washed across my wall at 7:03, and I was already at the window. The sheriff's cruiser was at the gate, idling, its light bar cycling, the early morning light behind it still gray and thin. In the passenger seat, close enough that I could read her expression clearly through the property's front wrought iron, Sarah. Gray-streaked hair, reading glasses pushed up onto her head, the particular upright posture of a woman who hasn't slept and isn't apologizing for it. She was pointing toward the back of the house, toward my window, toward me. I pressed both palms flat against the glass and tried to see all of it at once. The cruiser. Sarah. The gate. And then the figure already on the driveway side, already positioned, already performing. Sterling. He was in a silk robe, navy, monogrammed, the robe of a man who had anticipated the knock at the gate and dressed for the role it required. He was holding a coffee mug in his left hand and a folder in his right, the folder with the court-stamped guardianship papers, the emergency order, the judge's signature, the documented stove incident that had not happened and the wandering that had not occurred. He was looking at the officer with the expression of a man who is exhausted by his circumstances and grateful for the help, grief mixed with the particular defeated patience of a devoted family member doing the very best he can. My chest swelled with something jagged and hot that I could not afford to spend. I raised my fist and knocked on the glass. Then both fists, harder. The officer was looking at the papers. I could see the sequence from my window with the specific clarity of a person who has spent 40 years reading a room from across it. Which patient is declining, which family member is about to break, which resident is about to make a decision that will cost somebody. The officer looked at the guardianship documents. Then he looked at Sterling, at the silk robe and the coffee mug and the grief performance, and then back at the documents. I hit the glass harder. The reinforced pain absorbed it and returned almost nothing outward. The central air conditioning system, which ran continuously in this house because the Florida heat demanded it, produced a constant low hum that, I understood now, had been one of the design features of keeping me in this specific room. The sound traveled inward. It did not travel out. Sterling turned toward my window and said something to the officer, and as he spoke his right hand came up and 2 fingers touched his temple, the lightest, most casual gesture in the world, the kind you make without breaking eye contact, the universal shorthand that has been weaponized against people in my situation for as long as the situation has existed. She's not well. The officer nodded. Not skeptically. Not as a question. He nodded the nod of a man who has received a satisfactory explanation for a situation he would rather not spend more time on. He patted Sterling on the shoulder, the pat of an ally rather than an investigator, and turned back toward the cruiser. Sarah's face was against the passenger window. I could see the exact moment she understood what was happening, the change in her expression from urgent to helpless, which are 2 of the most different feelings in the world and which look, from the outside, almost identical. Her hand came up against the glass toward mine. The cruiser reversed. The lights continued their cycle for another half block and then went off. The gate stayed closed. The hope I had spent all night refusing to call hope dissolved anyway, because the body is not always subject to the mind's classifications, and what replaced it was something colder and more clarifying than anything I had felt since Tuesday morning. Sterling didn't just own the house and the narrative and the court documents. He had prepared for exactly this contingency. He had rehearsed this. He had known the moment a new phone connected to the local towers, he'd said so himself, which meant he'd been waiting for this move, which meant the cruiser at the gate was not a surprise. It was a test. And he had just shown me how completely he thought he'd passed it. The door didn't open. It was ripped. The frame cracked at the latch plate, the wood giving way around the bolt housing with a sound like a rifle shot, and Sterling stood in the opening with the specific, terrible stillness of a man who has stopped managing himself. Not yelling. Past yelling. The cold on the other side of red. He was holding Tabor's Cyclopedic Medical Dictionary in his left hand. He was holding the burner phone in his right. I did not move from the center of the room. I held the nursing mask, the neutral expression, the steady eyes, the posture of a woman who is not processing what she's seeing, and I watched him with the clinical attention I had given to 1,000 situations that were trying to unseat me. You think you're clever, Lillian? His voice was a whisper, which is always worse than shouting. He threw the book against the wall. The pages, Tabor's, 22nd edition, 40 years of reference material, separated from the spine and cascaded across the floor in a soft, horrible rush, the paper nest cavity in the middle section visible for a half second before the pages covered it. He looked at the phone in his hands. Then he took it in both fists and twisted, and the plastic housing cracked down the center with a sound that went into my back teeth. He dropped the pieces onto my cot. He stepped into the room until the air had nowhere to go except around him. We monitor the local cell towers. He said it conversationally, which was the most frightening register he had used yet. The way you describe a system you've already built and trust completely. We knew the moment a new ESN checked in on this property. His eyes were on mine. I wanted to see who you'd call. I wanted to see if you'd prove my case. He leaned forward until his face was close enough that I could smell the coffee and, underneath it, the cold metal cologne that I had by now come to associate entirely with threat. Calling a former colleague to rescue you? Paranoia. Delusions of persecution. He straightened. It's all going in the report for the Glades facility. You didn't just fail, Lillian. His mouth arranged itself into something that had the shape of a smile and none of the content. You gave me the final nail for your coffin. I looked at him. In 40 years in the ICU I have looked at people who were dying and people who were lying and people who were doing both simultaneously, and I have learned to read all of them. I read Sterling now the way I read a monitor, not for what it told me about itself, but for what it told me about the patient. What I saw was a man who needed this to be over. Who was running on adrenaline and debt and the specific desperation of someone who has committed fully to a plan and cannot afford to let it fail. Who had just told me, in his performance of victory, exactly what his next move was. The Glades facility. The transport at dawn. Which meant I had tonight. Brenda came in behind him with a silver tray. Not the plastic medication cup. A large oral syringe, the kind used for liquid medication administration in patients who cannot or will not swallow solids, 10 milliliters, the barrel filled with a thick, milky white suspension I identified in the 2 seconds before Sterling spoke again. Since you're so agitated, we're going to help you sleep through the transition. Haldol. Lorazepam. The combination used in acute behavioral emergencies, in genuinely violent or severely psychotic patients, in circumstances that required rapid chemical sedation of someone who was a danger to themselves or others. A dose calibrated not to treat but to erase, to produce, within 20 minutes, a state of profound sedation that could last 6 to 8 hours and leave behind, in a body as small as mine, a residual cognitive fog that could take days to fully clear. If that hit my bloodstream, the woman who knew the location of the Second National Branch and the maiden name on the safety deposit box key and the contents of the investment trust documents would be, for all practical purposes, gone. Not dead. Worse. Present but unreachable. The Lillian Sterling needed her to be, finally, chemically enforced. Sterling's hand closed around my jaw. His thumb pressed into the joint below my ear, hard enough to matter, precise enough to be deliberate. Open up, Lillian. The syringe touched my teeth. I had approximately 2 seconds to make the most important clinical decision of my life. I did not fight. Fighting would have achieved nothing except the needle, which was the backup for the syringe and which Brenda was almost certainly carrying. I had spent 40 years learning the difference between resistance and strategy, and this was not a moment for resistance. I let my body go. Vasovagal syncope is the medical term for what happens when the body's autonomic nervous system overreacts to a trigger, fear, pain, emotional shock, and produces a rapid drop in heart rate and blood pressure that results in loss of consciousness. It is the most common cause of fainting in otherwise healthy people. It has a distinctive presentation: the eyes roll upward and to the side, the muscles go soft in a specific progressive sequence starting with the face and neck, the breathing becomes shallow and slightly irregular, the skin pales. I had seen it hundreds of times. I had treated it hundreds of times. I knew exactly what it looked like from the outside because I had spent 4 decades watching it happen to other people. I rolled my eyes back. I breathed out, one long, shuddering exhalation that let the diaphragm soften and the chest settle. I let my heart rate drop through the controlled breathing technique I used on the bike for high-grade climbs, the specific long exhale short inhale rhythm that activates the parasympathetic nervous system. I felt my blood pressure responding. I let my head loll against the headboard. I stayed still. "Damn it," Sterling said. His fingers found my wrist, checking my pulse, the way someone checks a pulse who has not been trained to check a pulse. Unprofessional. His fingers were too far from the radial artery. He got something, but not the clear, accurate reading a clinician would get. "She's out. Probably the stress." A pause. "Just leave it, Brenda. We'll load her into the van at dawn. She isn't going anywhere now." I lay like a discarded doll across the cot and listened to 2 sets of footsteps recede into the hallway. The deadbolt engaged one last time with the heavy, certain sound of people who believe they have finished. I lay still for 4 full minutes after the footsteps faded, for minutes of the specific measured patience of a woman who has worked code blues and knows that the moment you stop managing the room is not the moment the patient is actually stable. I listened to the house settle into its late-night patterns. The television was off. The security route went past on schedule, the footsteps and the dog in the particular quiet of a perimeter that no longer expected anything from the inside. "The transport van will be here at 6 a.m., Sterling had said to Brenda in the hallway, not bothering to lower his voice. "Tell the guards to stay on the perimeter. She's dead to the world until noon. 6 a.m. I looked at the thin line of moonlight crossing the floor from the barred window. The moon was high and beginning its descent, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. 3 hours. Perhaps a little more. The humidity was thick even inside the room. Through the small window, the moon threw a pale rectangle across the pine floorboards, and the house around me was the specific silence of a building whose inhabitants had, finally, stopped listening. I opened my eyes. The woman who had been sprawled across the cot with her head lolling and her eyes rolled back was gone. I sat up in one smooth motion, fluid and silent, the way you rise when you've been conserving rather than sleeping. The screwdriver was in the pocket of the housecoat, exactly where I'd left it. The waterproof pouch sat solid against my skin beneath 3 layers of wicking fabric. Birth certificate. Safety deposit key. $1,400. I stood up and moved to the window. I had studied this window for 3 days with the attention of a woman who had decided, at some point in the second day of her imprisonment, that the door was never going to be the answer. The door had a deadbolt they controlled. The door was the obvious exit, and obvious exits are, by definition, the exits that are covered. Sterling was a litigator who had planned this operation with the thoroughness of a man facing federal charges. He had covered the door, the phone, the cruiser at the gate, the narrative with the officer, the cell towers. He had not covered the window because the window had iron decorative bars and reinforced glass and a 73-year-old woman on the other side of it. But I had a screwdriver, and I had studied those bars for 3 days, and what I had observed was that the ironwork was decorative rather than structural, mounted to the exterior frame with 4 screws per bar, the screws standard hex heads, painted over but not epoxied, the work of a contractor who had been told ornamental rather than security. And the frame itself was the original late 70s construction, wood, not reinforced, the kind of framing that absorbed 40 years of Florida humidity and expanded and contracted with the seasons until the screws no longer sat quite flush. 3 hours until 6 a.m. I gripped the screwdriver, set the blade against the first screw head, and began. I did not break the glass. A nurse knows, has always known, in the marrow, that silence is a clinical requirement. Noise is the enemy of control, and control is the only thing I had left in sufficient supply. I worked the flathead screwdriver into the vinyl stop along the window's bottom rail, prying with steady, even pressure, the technique of a woman who has learned that most things yield not to force but to patience applied at the correct angle. The vinyl strip came away with a soft, adhesive resistance, like a bandage from old skin. The locking cam was the second obstacle. A simple mechanism, painted over, slightly swollen from years of humidity, but simple. I seated the screwdriver blade against the cam housing and applied lateral pressure, slow and deliberate, until I felt the metal give in the specific way metal gives when it has been asked nicely for long enough. A single muffled pop. The cam rotated. The sash moved upward with the reluctant groan of a window that had not been opened in years. I controlled the sound with both palms, lifting and steadying simultaneously, allowing the frame to travel in increments no larger than an inch at a time. The Florida night came in around the gap, humid, salt-heavy, the smell of the Gulf and jasmine and the particular living warmth of coastal air after midnight. It hit my face like a damp towel and I breathed it in deliberately, filling my lungs with everything the servants' quarters had denied me for 4 days. I checked the outside. The decorative bars were gone. 3 of the 4 had come away cleanly under the screwdriver's attention in the small hours, the painted screws surrendering one by one to focused pressure and 40 years of expanded wood. The 4th bar I'd worked loose and set aside on the floor. The opening was narrow. I am not a large woman. 40 years on a bike and a Mediterranean diet and the disciplined frugality of someone who has always understood the body as a tool rather than a trophy had left me, at 73, with a frame that was more architecture than decoration. I went through feet first, hands gripping the sill, lowering myself along the stucco exterior with the controlled descent of a person who is not willing to sprain an ankle 3 miles from the only place that can save her. My feet hit the mulch with a sound like a soft exhale. I pressed my back against the stucco wall and held still, listening. 61 beats per minute. Steady. The guard's footsteps came around the kitchen corner on schedule. Heavy heel strike, the same pattern I'd catalogued through 72 hours of listening, the footsteps of a man who had done this rotation enough times that his body had stopped paying attention to it. The flashlight beam swept the pool deck, the patio furniture, the far edge of the lawn. I counted his retreating steps until they hit the pavement of the pool surround, 12 steps, the sound changing from grass to hardscape, and then I moved. Not a sprint in the cinematic sense. I am 73 years old and I have a surgical scar on my left knee, and I am not pretending otherwise. What I did was move with the efficiency of a machine that has been maintained for exactly this purpose: low center of gravity, arms controlled, feet reading the ground through the thin soles of my cycling shoes the way they had read 1,000 miles of coastal trail. Across the lawn in the mulch-silent darkness, through the shadow of the equipment alcove, to the tool shed in 12 seconds. The tarp came back from the lawnmower with one pull. There. The Colnago. Carbon fiber, 15 years of my care invested in it, hanging from the same 2 points on the wall where I'd placed it 6 months ago for the last tune-up. They hadn't sold it. Of course they hadn't, too specialized, too identifiable, a piece of equipment with a serial number and a provenance that would require actual knowledge of the cycling market to liquidate. Sterling dealt in art and jewelry and financial instruments. He didn't know what a Colnago was worth, and so he hadn't known what to do with it, and that specific gap in his knowledge had just become the most consequential oversight of his legal career. I ran my hands along the frame in the dark. Carbon fiber, intact. Tires, I pressed with my thumb, 70 psi, enough. The wheels were true. The drivetrain responded to a careful hand turn of the pedal without catching. I hoisted the frame to my shoulder and moved to the hibiscus hedge. Javier had maintained a gap near the northeast corner of the property, a convenience for his equipment access that had never been visible from the driveway and that I had never mentioned to anyone, including my husband, because some knowledge is worth keeping sovereign. I went through it sideways, the Colnago's handlebars clearing the hedge by 2 inches, and I was on the street side before the guard's flashlight completed its next pool deck sweep. The coastal fog had come in. The street was empty and gray and mine. I mounted and clipped in and rode. 5 miles through the pre-dawn dark, and my body remembered every inch of them. The enclave was silent at this hour, the way wealthy neighborhoods are always silent at night, the silence of people who have purchased their distance from the world and deployed it fully. The mansions stood behind their fences and their landscaping like objects in a museum after closing. The streetlights laid pale gold circles on the asphalt at measured intervals, and I moved through them in a steady, disciplined cadence, my lungs opening up with the particular gratitude of a respiratory system that has been denied real exertion for 4 days. My quads found the rhythm they'd maintained for 15 years and settled into it with the ease of a system returning to its native state. The burn was familiar and welcome, the specific, productive discomfort of a body doing what it was designed to do. The salt air came off the gulf on my left in waves, and I leaned forward over the handlebars, and the Colnago moved under me the way it had always moved, responsive, precise, an extension of intention rather than an obstacle to it. Sterling had thought this was a toy. A senior's vanity. A mobility device for a woman who couldn't be trusted with a car. I pushed the cadence up a gear and felt the speed respond, the coastal fog parting in front of me, the familiar landmarks appearing and receding in the gray pre-dawn light, the park, the branch library, the corner where I always noted the time to gauge my pace. My ICU-trained lungs pulled in the salt air with the automatic efficiency of a system that has been conditioned over 4 decades of morning miles, fueling a body that a judge had declared incompetent and a litigator had declared finished. I arrived at the Second National Branch at 4:50 a.m., my skin slick, my mind as clear and cold and edge-sharp as a properly honed scalpel. I locked the Colnago to the bike rack outside, the same rack I'd used on 100 Monday mornings before the world became what it became, and I went in to reclaim my life. The automated lobby hummed to life at 5 a.m. precisely. I inserted the card that did not exist in Sterling's version of reality, the one connected to Lillian Miller, the account that predated my marriage by 11 years, that had been accruing and compounding under my maiden name while the social version of me attended charity galas and signed holiday cards with a different surname. The PIN had not changed in 8 years. I punched it in with steady fingers. The heavy glass door slid open on a whisper of cold, pressurized air. The vault room was everything the servants' quarters was not: refrigerated, ordered, smelling of ozone and old paper and the specific mineral cold of serious money stored seriously. The morning clerk was young, efficient, and had the particular demeanor of someone working a 5 a.m. banking shift who has learned to process whatever comes through the door without editorializing. He looked at my cycling gear, compression tights, wicking jersey, the light jacket I'd layered over it in deference to the bank's air conditioning, and then he looked at my ID, the one with the name that was never on Sterling's court documents, and then he looked at his screen. He saw what his screen showed him: a legacy account, high net worth client, 8-year perfect standing record, biometric match confirmed. Box 402, Ms. Miller. Please. He turned his key. I turned mine. The steel door of box 402 opened with the particular groan of a mechanism built to last a century and performing accordingly. I carried the box to the private table in the small, refrigerated room and sat down and opened it with the steady hands of a woman who has been waiting for this specific moment for longer than she realized. The documents were exactly as I'd left them. I spread them on the table in order, the order in which they would need to be deployed. The sequence that a 30-year career in managing what other people didn't notice had taught me was the difference between a surgical strike and a blunt instrument. The original partnership agreement for Sterling and Associates. 14 pages of legal architecture built on a financial foundation its primary beneficiary had never examined closely enough, because the silent majority shareholder of the investment trust that had seeded his firm's initial capital was a name he hadn't connected to the woman he'd moved into the servants' quarters. He'd had 15 years to look. He was a litigator by training and an arrogant man by disposition, and arrogant men do not look at the fine print of their own good fortune because they attribute their good fortune to themselves. The Miller Trust. My name, my construction, my 30 years of disciplined attention. 51% of his professional existence, held quietly, patiently, in a steel box in a bank branch 5 miles from the house he'd just tried to steal. And beneath it, the document I had filed away 5 years ago and hoped, in whatever part of me was still capable of hope about Ashley's family, never to use. The ethics report, unsigned, unfiled, documented with the precision of a woman who spent 40 years ensuring that every observation was recorded accurately. Sterling's first attempt, 5 years ago, to quietly borrow from a client's escrow account. I had found the evidence in papers I was not supposed to see and had retained copies of it with the specific, patient calculation of a person who understood that the right moment to use leverage is not always the moment you first acquire it. I had been holding the kill switch for years. I spread the documents on the refrigerated table under the fluorescent light and looked at them for a long moment, the complete architecture of a man's professional destruction, assembled quietly over 15 years by a woman he had dismissed as a soft target. Data doesn't lie. The secure phone at the bank desk had a dial tone at 5:15 a.m., and I used it with the brisk efficiency of someone who has a 36-minute window before a transport van arrives at her address. Marcus Bellamy in Savannah answered on the second ring, which told me he was already awake, which told me, with the small, warm satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis, that Sarah had reached him after the cruiser left the gate. He was 71 years old and had been practicing estate and trust law for 43 years, and my late husband had handed him his first major client referral in 1987, and he had not forgotten it. "Lillian," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been sitting with his phone in his hand waiting for a call he wasn't sure was coming. "Marcus. I need emergency resolutions filed in the next 40 minutes. I've been ready since 4 a.m. The second call was to the 24-hour process service, a firm I had retained twice before for less consequential matters and whose senior server had, on both occasions, demonstrated the useful combination of discretion and speed that characterized people who were good at their work. 722 Harbor Lane, I told him, giving the address the way you give coordinates. I need an emergency termination notice served at 6 a.m. Partnership dissolution. Ethics complaint courier to the State Bar. I need confirmation of service before 6:30. We'll be there at 6, he said. When you have the capital, the world moves at your speed. I had understood this for 30 years and had never once mistaken it for anything other than what it was, not privilege, but leverage, earned and maintained with the same discipline with which I had maintained everything else. The gears of the legal system are heavy and they grind slowly, except when someone with the right documents applies the right pressure at the right point. By 5:45, the gears were moving. I signed the emergency resolution at the bank's secure desk with the unhurried, precise hand of a woman who has been signing important documents for 40 years and knows that the signature is not a formality but a statement. Lillian Miller. The slant of it, the legibility, medical style, exact, unambiguous. As majority shareholder of Sterling and Associates, I exercised the moral turpitude clause of the original partnership agreement, a provision I had insisted be included 15 years ago. In the quiet, unremarkable way I had always insisted on the provisions that mattered, and which Sterling had signed without reading closely because men who are desperate for capital do not interrogate its terms. The clause was clear, documented ethical violations, including the attempted chemical incapacitation of a competent adult for financial gain, constituted grounds for immediate termination and dissolution of partnership interest. I was not just firing him. I was dissolving his stake. I was removing the foundation on which his entire professional identity had been constructed, the floor beneath his bespoke suits and his courtroom baritone and his practiced performance of authority. The ethics complaint was 3 pages of documented fact. The dates of medication administration attempts. The specific pharmacological compounds involved, Haldol, lorazepam, and the quantities represented by the syringe. The bruising on my arm, documented in the notes I had maintained since Tuesday morning, date stamped. The forged stove incident and fabricated wandering that had served as the basis for the fraudulent guardianship order. Sterling's own words, spoken in my presence, connecting his IRS debt explicitly to his motives. I had administered medication for 40 years. I knew exactly what had been in that syringe, exactly what it would have done, and exactly what it meant that it had been prepared and presented to a competent adult who had not consented. I signed the complaint with the same hand and tucked the copies into the jersey pocket over my sternum. The cold satisfaction I felt was not warm and it was not triumphant. It was the specific, flat satisfaction of a correct diagnosis followed by the correct treatment. The relief of the system functioning as designed when the right variables are finally in the right configuration. I took my copies. I walked back through the refrigerated air of the vault room, through the lobby, through the heavy glass door, into the Florida pre-dawn. The Colnago was where I'd left it. I beat the sun back to the estate by 20 minutes and the transport van by 15. The eastern sky was the pale gray-pink of a sunrise that hadn't committed yet when I rode back through the neighborhood, the Gulf air warm and salt-heavy against my face. The fog was beginning to lift. The estate appeared on my left as it had appeared on 1,000 mornings, the white stucco, the jasmine along the front walk, the bougainvillea needing attention, the wrought iron gate standing open in the early light. I rode through the gate. The 2 security guards were at their posts near the front entrance, and they looked at me with the specific expression of people who have been hired to prevent something from happening and are now watching it happen anyway, that particular paralysis of a plan meeting a variable it didn't account for. I did not slow down. I did not explain myself. I rode up the front drive with the posture of a woman returning to her own property from her morning route, which is what I was, and I leaned the Colnago against the terrace railing, and I climbed the stairs. The terrace was where I had always liked to sit in the mornings before the heat built, the wicker chair that faced the driveway and, beyond it, the Gulf. I had sat here on 1,000 mornings with my husband and, later, alone. I sat in it now. From the back corner of the tool shed I retrieved the small French press Javier kept there for his own morning coffee, a habit of his I had always appreciated and never commented on, and I made tea with the electric kettle I'd unplugged and carried out here in the 3 minutes before I sat down. Jasmine. The smell of it mixed with the salt and the bougainvillea and the specific morning smell of this property that was mine, that had always been mine, from which I had been displaced for 4 days by people who had confused my patience for weakness. I checked my watch. 6 a.m. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The Gulf turned to liquid gold as the sun breached the horizon. The white transport van came up the drive at 6 on the dot, punctual, which surprised me slightly, and then didn't, because Sterling was a man who needed things to go according to schedule because his schedules were the only thing between him and the acknowledgement that his entire plan had been built on a foundation he'd never bothered to examine. Memory Care Transit. The logo on the van's side panel was tasteful and institutional and, in the morning light, one of the cruelest things I had ever read. Sterling and Ashley came out onto the porch behind me. I heard them, the door opening and their footsteps on the stone, before I heard Sterling check his watch and the small, satisfied sound of a man whose appointment has arrived on time. They hadn't seen me yet. I was sitting in the wicker chair with my back to the door, facing the driveway, and the morning light on the Gulf was very beautiful, and I waited. The moment Sterling's eyes found me had a specific, physical quality I could feel from where I was sitting. The silence that preceded his voice was the silence of a man whose world has just experienced an event his model did not predict. Before he found his voice, the black sedan came through the gate behind the van. The process server was a compact man in a navy tie, carrying a waterproof envelope with the brisk, unhurried quality of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer requires ceremony. He stepped out of the sedan and looked at the porch, where Sterling was still standing in the particular arrested posture of someone whose momentum has just been removed. Sterling, last name? Sterling nodded. The automatic response of a man whose name has been called in enough courtrooms that the reflex is permanent. You've been served. The envelope changed hands with the practiced efficiency of a legal instrument finding its intended recipient. Notice of immediate termination, partnership dissolution, and an emergency stay on all guardianship proceedings, filed in the 11th Judicial Circuit 40 minutes ago. The State Bar Association has been couriered a formal ethics complaint, received and logged at 5:52 this morning. I stood up from the wicker chair. I am 5 feet 7 inches tall, and I am lean, and I was wearing cycling gear that had been pressed against my skin through 5 miles and a vault room and another 5 miles back, and my silver-white hair had been doing whatever it wanted for the last 4 days, and I leaned against the terrace railing and looked at Sterling over the rim of my teacup with the direct, unblinking steadiness that 40 years in the ICU had made as natural to me as breathing. He had ripped open the envelope. The papers were in his hands. His face had moved through several configurations before settling on the specific, bloodless gray of a man reading a document that is dismantling his life in plain language. He looked at the signature. Lillian Miller. He looked at the partnership agreement header. He looked at the Miller Trust ownership percentage. He looked at me. You were at the bank? His voice had lost every calibrated register. What was left was something thin and cracked and, finally, honest. I set the teacup down on the wicker side table. I've owned your firm for 15 years, Sterling. I kept my voice at the level I used for delivering difficult information to families in the ICU, clear, unhurried, without malice, because malice is a waste of oxygen and the facts are sufficient on their own. I've owned your debt for 3. You're fired. Your bar license is under review as of this morning. I looked at my watch. You have 10 minutes to take your wife and leave this property before the sheriff arrives to enforce the restraining order. Ashley made a sound behind him. I didn't look at her. The security guards read the papers the process server handed them with the focused attention of men whose calculus had just changed fundamentally. They were professionals, private security, hired muscle, and the defining characteristic of professionals is that they follow the money, and the money had just, in front of them and with full legal documentation, changed direction. They stepped aside. Ashley's voice rose into something high and panicked, not words, exactly, more the sound of a person experiencing the specific shock of a plan failing so completely that the failure hasn't yet resolved into meaning. Sterling said nothing. He stood on the driveway with the papers in his hand and his eyes on the ground, and he looked, for the first time since he'd appeared in my doorway on Tuesday morning, exactly like what he was, a man who had borrowed his authority from a source that had just revoked it. He didn't go inside for his things. Neither did Ashley. Whether that was shock or the instinctive recognition that there was nothing inside those walls that was theirs, that there had never been anything inside those walls that was theirs, I couldn't tell you, and I found I didn't particularly need to. They walked down the driveway. Sterling in his morning clothes, Ashley in whatever she'd been wearing, the papers fluttering slightly in his grip. Two figures diminishing against the morning light, growing smaller as the driveway curved toward the gate. The transport van followed them out. Empty. The Memory Care Transit logo moved past the gate and out of my sight line and did not come back. The hibiscus hedge stood at the property edge, the gap near the northeast corner where the Colnago had passed through in the dark a few hours ago, needing Javier's attention. The vultures had found no meat here. The silence that settled over the property was not the predatory silence of Tuesday morning. It had a different quality entirely, the silence of a space returning to its own nature after an interruption. The jasmine was coming in on the morning air. The gulf was audible at the edge of it, the low rhythmic presence I had fallen asleep to for 11 years. I sat back down in the wicker chair. The new phone, delivered by courier at 5:30 as part of the logistics Marcus had arranged, was in the pocket of my jersey. I took it out and scrolled to Ashley's name. The block function is remarkably simple. One tap and the person is gone, not from memory, not from the record of what happened, but from the particular channel through which she had last reached me. I did the same for Sterling. The phone went back into my pocket. I looked at the garden. The bougainvillea was reaching over the path the way it always did when Javier had been away for more than a week, a resilient, mildly chaotic plant that responded to attention and neglect with equal enthusiasm. The hibiscus needed shaping. The jasmine along the front walk was healthy but wanted cutting back on the right side. There was work to be done, the ordinary, continuous work of maintaining a living thing, and Javier would be back tomorrow morning with his thermos and his tools and the 12 years of knowledge that told him, without needing to be told, exactly where to begin. I was aware of my body in the way you become aware of it after sustained exertion, the specific satisfaction of muscles that have been used correctly, the mild ache in my quads from the pre-dawn miles, the deeper tiredness of 4 days of sustained vigilance beginning to make itself known now that the vigilance was no longer required. My left knee had the faint warmth it always got after long rides, the scar tissue from the old cycling injury that I had learned to read the way I read all physical data, accurately, without drama. I went inside. The library was where it had always been, the room they hadn't stripped, perhaps because books held no obvious market value to people who didn't read them, or perhaps because they'd run out of time before they'd gotten to it. The shelves were intact. The reading chair was where I'd placed it 7 years ago, angled toward the east window for the morning light. I sat down and opened the ledger. The Lillian Miller accounts. 30 years of entries in my slanted, precise medical hand, dates, amounts, transactions, the slow and steady accumulation of a professional life managed in parallel with a personal one. The trust balance. The investment positions. The property holdings in Savannah that Ashley had been looking for in the wrong room of the wrong house, rifling through my cotton underwear for a filing system that existed in a bank vault 5 miles away. The numbers were as I had left them. Accurate, as data always is when it hasn't been interfered with. I was aware, as I sat with the ledger open on my lap and the morning light coming in through the east window, of a tiredness that was not weakness, the specific, complete fatigue of a system that has performed at its maximum capacity for an extended period and is now, appropriately, requesting rest. The code blue calm was releasing its hold on my nervous system with the gradual, well-ordered quality of a well-managed handoff. The shift was over. The patient, this situation, this household, this life, had been stabilized. The data confirmed it. The new locks were being scheduled. Marcus was filing the final motions. The State Bar Association had received their documentation. The sheriff's office had the restraining order. Every variable I could control had been controlled. Every instrument I had spent 30 years maintaining had been deployed at the correct moment and had functioned correctly. The system had held. I am 73 years old. I have 40 years of the ICU in my hands and my lungs and the particular architecture of my attention, which does not soften with age but sharpens, the way any instrument sharpens when it is properly maintained and consistently used. I had been declared incompetent by a judge who signed his name to a document built on fabricated incidents and a desperate man's timeline. I had been physically restrained in my own home, chemically threatened, isolated from every external ally, and scheduled for permanent disappearance before the next sunrise. And I had, with a flathead screwdriver and a vintage road bicycle and 30 years of patient, methodical preparation, taken back everything they had tried to take. I turned a page in the ledger and smoothed it flat against my knee. I was sovereign. The house was quiet. The data, as it had always been, was exactly right. I turned to the entry for the Miller Trust and began to read. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?